Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome back to my YouTube channel. If you're watching last week, you will have seen me introduce a layout design for a client in Sydney, Australia. And at the end of that video, we had reached this point where all the major elements of the design are filled in more or less in the right places, all the elevations worked out, and the customer very happy with the way everything is taking shape. I mentioned at the end of the last week's video that the client was still suffering delays and the basement was still several months out before they could even start that. And also I mentioned that he was going to try to get an extra few feet on the length of it so as to allow for longer trains. So here is the final basement design. Overall it was going to be 6.1 meters by 14 meters. So around 20 feet by 46. We did gain an extra few feet on the length. This drawing has the dimensions that the client gave me. I was still missing a few, as shown by the ABC annotations. This view shows the new basement site superimposed over the previous layout design. As you can see, we've gained about 6 feet on the length, but we have lost a little bit on the width. As a result of that, we are going to be losing the couch. I think I mentioned that at the start of the previous installment. It's no longer quite wide enough to get a couch in with the 3-foot aisle and benchwork wide enough to get the desired railroad. So we're going to abandon the couch and we're going to extend the harbour into this area. In fact, the client said he preferred that idea anyway, even if there was still room for the couch. He liked the idea of more harbour. Anyway, getting the existing layout to fit the new space should be fairly easy. The ethanol plant has to be shortened slightly, but we have plenty of length. We can have a full 3-foot wide benchwork at the end. I had cut it down significantly before because I was trying to save as much length as possible for the main yard. The other place where I'm going to have to reduce the design is in this end curve at the end of the peninsula. As you can see, the peninsula is now about a foot narrower than it used to be. So this curve has to be sharpened down slightly. Other than that, it's basically good news. Most of the main operating areas can be spread out a little bit. So here is the work in progress. What I've done at this point is cut apart the previous design and place chunks of it approximately where they're going to be going in the new room. You can see here the ethanol plant can be expanded quite a bit on the width, but we do have to trim the length. This town on the top edge can be more or less as designed, as can most of the harbour area, and the intention at this point was to use the extra length along this wall just to give an extra few feet of open run between the two operating areas. Here is the upper deck mostly hooked up. I still haven't adjusted the ethanol plant yet, but I have redrawn the main yard. And if you recall from last week, I said I wasn't happy with the way it was set out. It looked too straight and boring, but that was because I was just seeing how much yard could be fitted into the space. Well, with this one, the site is a few feet longer, so the arrival departure tracks can be extended. But rather than squeeze the maximum size classification bowl, I've cut it back a little bit, which gives it what I think is a more pleasing shape. Prototype yard areas tend not to have every square inch full of track. There's usually some unused space. So by cutting back the classification bowl at both ends, particularly this end, there's room for a yard office and maybe some sheds. And I've cut it back at this end just a couple of inches, just to give more of a visual separation between the AD tracks and the classification tracks. Now, one of the things that the customer suggested at about this point in the process was to have the lower harbour, where the mouse is now, switched by a short line which would interchange with the Class 1 railroad. And I thought that was probably doable. We could have it disappear under the ethanol plant for a single staging track. Now obviously access to that staging track is going to be somewhat restricted, so I don't want to put a big yard in there, but a single track or maybe 2 tracks would probably be okay. As long as the track in there is bulletproof, there's no reason to expect derailments. And trains would have to be backed out onto the visible portion of the railroad between sessions to be restaged for the next session. Basically that would mean just moving the locomotive to the other end of the train. So here is that design with most of the upper deck hooked up properly. The ethanol plant has been adjusted, the short line's been included. I still haven't hooked up this corner under the stairs, but that's because at this point in the process I did not have any dimensions for the stairs. On the short line railroad, I've given it 3 through tracks instead of just a single run round. That sort of a design is often a lot more workable, allowing a spare track for something, especially considering the run round is fairly short. It may well require that the short line crew leaves part of the train on the main line and runs round it in 2 bites. There's plenty of height to get a staging track in under the ethanol plant. In later plans we did make it a 2-track yard instead of a single track, but the turnout can be in this area here where it can easily be accessible with a small piece of removable scenery. Here is the next iteration of that design. I have now finally hooked up this corner properly, and I've drawn in the paper mill. There's a lot of annotations on this drawing. I've also included several of the structures that the client has already built. These 2 background structures along the top wall, Stoddart Industries and Arctic Foods, the client has already built, along with a blue warehouse which we've named Blueberry Fruit Packing. And those I managed to get accurate dimensions from him, so I've incorporated them in the design. Arctic Foods does have to be shaved along the back edge because he built it as a parallel sided structure, and obviously I couldn't get a parallel track in there. The last area to be filled in was the paper mill, and when I sent this version to the client he was really excited because he was really looking forward to that. In fact, he wrote back and said, "I can't wait to switch the paper mill." He had already built one structure which was supposed to be part of the paper mill. Here it is drawn in the access opening. But we both decided that it was going to be too small to look right, given the fact that we had enough space to build a good sized mill. So in later drawings I ended up moving it to the top right corner, where it's going to be against the backdrop and represent a municipal power plant. By surrounding it with tightly packed small trees, it could look like a larger structure further away in forced perspective. Although it may not be clear on this drawing, I probably should have mentioned it last week, the steel fabricating industry in the back is designed to have a removable roof, and that will form a stand-up access opening for detailing the scene in the back of the alcove. The other 2 access openings aren't really needed for accessing the visible portion, although in both cases they're useful for getting to some hidden spurs. And the only other pop-up access hole is the one behind the turntable. There are a few turnouts at the back, which would be a long reach to maintain from the aisle side, so that's why that access hole is there. Note that the backdrop goes behind it and not in front, thus making it far more useful. Now I still don't have dimensions for the area under the stairs, so I haven't bothered filling in this properly. I'm assuming there's just going to be a general merchandise pier with a decent sized ship in front of it, and warehouses in the alcove under the stairs. Here is that same drawing with the elevations included. Note that I have arranged for the line to the harbour to drop all the way. Most of it is on a minimum grade because I'm trying to keep this corner as low as possible while leaving as much clearance as possible for the workbench under the harbour area. So for the first 40 feet of the harbour run we only drop 2 inches, and then after we cross over the short line the grade steepens down to the start of the intermodal yard, and then an opposite grade comes down from the interchange point to the short line. I did extend the rear track of the short line yard, allowing for a slightly longer run round, although depending on train length it might still be necessary to run round in 2 bites. And that's an operating wrinkle that the client really likes. The staging track for the short line can of course be plenty long enough. It can go all the way to the north wall, a distance of almost 20 feet. And we're assuming that this short line is a water level route that connects with a different Class 1 railroad at the other end of its run. That will allow a higher proportion of the cars from the car float to go down the short line instead of being pushed up the ramp to the Class 1 railroad. That way we can justify longer trains on the short line. And since we're assuming it's a fairly level route, it's probably going to be run by just a pair of 1200 horsepower switches back to back. that would be all the horsepower they need. Here is the lower level with the elevations drawn in. Note how on the divided mainline scene the two tracks are at different elevations. For most of the length there is around about a 4-inch elevation difference, and the rear track enters the second lap of the helix. Or to put that another way, the inside loop of the helix makes one extra lap. Something else to note on this drawing are the two tracks, one at this end where the mouse is now, and one at this end labelled to lower staging. For any of my viewers who have watched a fair number of my layout design videos, you'll know that I always stress including as much staging yard capacity as possible, and the client for this railroad was well aware of that need. This main staging yard shows 16 tracks, which is a little bit tight. We ended up reducing it to 15 tracks, allowing for marginally more finger space between each one. But even with 16 tracks, it wasn't going to be enough for the kind of operating session that the client wanted to run. So I came up with ideas for additional staging yard capacity. These two tracks that I've already pointed out both run around the top of the plan, cross each other on a flyover about here, and run round to another staging yard below this one. Now it can't be as wide, because with a big yard like this, it's important that there's enough separation between decks to be able to reach your upper torso into the space. Otherwise there's no way of reaching the rear tracks. Now since I can't get that much separation between this main staging yard and the lower one is only going to be about 23 inches wide with 9 tracks on it. And here is the third staging yard that I've incorporated. I've called it mezzanine staging, and this one is above the main staging yard instead of below it. And for the same reason as before, it can't be full width because there is insufficient clearance to get your torso between the levels. And I need to make sure that it doesn't restrict access to the main staging yard, which is why this is also another much narrower shelf, but this time over the back of the staging yard instead of being under the front of it. And note how all the turnouts are confined to the front edge of that benchwork. This provides 7 stub-ended staging tracks, and you'll either head in and back out, or back in and head out, or alternatively you can drive in forward and then bring another locomotive onto the rear of the train to take it out. I've put a pair of crossovers over the workbench. At the moment it's a double crossover with 2 double slips, although I did simplify that arrangement to use 6 regular turnouts. The reason for the lead track is so you don't have to back long trains uphill. Notice how the short branch that leads to these stub-ended staging tracks is long enough so that it can be level and allowing sufficient clearance for the climbing main line to rise over the staging at this point. And then keeping this lead track level, it means that you can back trains along the level instead of having to back them uphill, as would be the case if I didn't include it. And of course they would appear in this scene down here unnecessarily. On a later plan I did modify this tail track because I felt it wasn't quite long enough, so I found a way of extending it. You'll see that on a later plan. Here is the lower staging yard that I told you about. I haven't drawn the flyover in this plan, and at this point this was only a concept drawing, which is why the yard ladders at both ends are pretty basic. I still need to modify them to get all the turnouts at the front. But as I said, this was just a concept design, just to send it off to the client and see if he agreed with adding the extra staging. And initially I was thinking, well, if I can just get him to accept 1 extra staging level, that would be enough. But he turned around and said, yeah, let's go with both of them, because as you said, you can never have too much staging. Here is the lower deck with a lot more detail filled in for the 2 visible mainline runs, suggesting the possible bridge types that we can include. It came out during conversation during the first layout design I did for this client that he would really like to have some big bridges on his railroad. And with this canyon scene along the lower deck, there's plenty of room for them. And the main reason for splitting the 2 main lines was to allow for some single track bridges where there's a lot more variety possible than with double track. Here is a cross section through the staging areas that I drew for the client, just to get the idea of how everything's going to fit in 3 dimensions. The most complex part of it is the shape of the joist necessary for the upper deck, where we've got the harbour in front, the ramp disappearing down through the frames, and the mezzanine staging, which has to be supported in such a way that we don't need longitudinal members at the front where they're going to get in the way of reaching the back of the main staging. And I'm also showing how I propose to mount all the control panels for the various staging yards between the second and third levels on an angle, so a normal height operator standing in the aisle is going to have a convenient view of the panel without having to crane his neck. The front of the panel will probably be attached to the legs between the levels, and the back of it can be braced against the framing for the mezzanine staging. Here is the lower deck completed with the scenery filled in. I've shown 3 industries in this corner: a pulpwood loading spur, a rural grain elevator, and a scrapyard, with the first few feet of the scrapyard spur also serving as a team track. I've shown a grade crossing and an abandoned depot, because with the period of the railroad, the depot would have been long since abandoned, possibly even demolished, but it could still be present, boarded up, and maybe even vandalized. I'm also showing an abandoned spur. The track's still there, heavily overgrown, but with the turnout removed, and I'm using a highway overpass to hide where the track disappears into staging. This drawing shows what I was talking about earlier, about how I extended the tail track for the mezzanine staging. Just by moving the helix a couple of inches makes all the difference, and we're really not going to miss those 2 inches that we sacrificed from the lower level scene. Here is the lower level staging, or the subway staging level as I'm referring to it, with the staging yard ladders modified at both ends to get the turnouts as far forward as possible. I've used a compound pinwheel ladder at this end. I didn't do the same at the other end because I wanted to get the track as far back as possible under the workbench to leave as much knee room as possible. So that's why I have a straight ladder at this point. And I've shown the flyover. I don't know if that's exactly where it's going to be. I've still got to calculate it so that the 2 tracks cross each other exactly where the difference in elevation is 4 inches. Now at this point I wanted to make a start on building the turnouts that the client was going to need. So before we can do that, we have to figure out exactly what trackage is going to be built in what rail size. This is the first drawing I did. The light coloured ballast represents the code 83, the pinkish colour the code 70, and the dark grey code 55. We can see that all the mainline tracks are in code 83, along with the AD tracks for the main yard and the excursion track. We're arguing that in order for the museum to run their excursion trains, they were forced to upgrade their station track to proper mainline standards. Also in code 83 is the entirety of the harbour yard. We're assuming that when the intermodal yard was put in, it required rebuilding the general merchandise yard, so that was all laid with new track. As I said, this was the first suggestion as to what to build in which rail size. Here was the one we eventually went with. We decided that the entire ethanol plant is going to have the large rail because that would have been put in by the Class 1 railroad company in fairly recent times. So in this view, all the trackage that was put in by the modern Class 1 railroad is code 83. Whereas on the short line, only their main line has anything as large as 70 with all their spurs in 55, as is the paper mill railroad, which we've determined is going to be a wholly owned subsidiary of the paper mill. Every yard of track they have is code 55. There's a couple of things worth talking about in this view. The only thing that's changed as far as the railroad is concerned is that we now have a junction in this corner. In actual fact, it's not going to be a working junction. The whole reason for including it is that it visually ties together the 2 main lines, so that it's obviously a divided double track rather than the same single track main line wrapping through the scene twice. But to avoid adding unnecessary complication to this area, it's going to be done entirely as a dummy. The turnouts will have already been dismantled, the rear track having been laid through it, and the front track still having the full-length turnout ties, but with the rail components dismantled and probably just strewn in the weeds. All the signal masts at this end and the heads from the signal gantry will have been removed and used elsewhere. We certainly don't need any working crossovers at this point, since we have some just the other side of the tunnel leading into the staging yard. And the last thing we want to do is to have to go to the expense and complexity of adding a whole new working interlocking plant that would serve no operational purpose. As I said, it's entirely cosmetic, just to visually join these tracks together. The other thing worth mentioning here is that we have two separate dispatcher locations. Dispatch 1 will be used when the client has a full operating session with a dedicated dispatcher with his own office. Dispatch 2 will be used when the client is operating the railroad either by himself or with just a couple of friends. And he'll just put the laptop on this small desk here and be able to control the signals without having to duck under the helix into the dispatcher's office each time. And this view shows clearly the locations of the 3 access openings on the upper deck. The one in the middle of the helix now becomes particularly useful because it means the dispatcher can stand up full height and stretch his legs during a session without having to come out of the office. The arrangement in this small town has also changed. I've removed the pulpwood spur from this location and put it at the end of the room on the opposite track. That means that this town will now be switched in both directions instead of just one, and the pulpwood spur and the abandoned industry lead are now the same track. We decided this was a lead track to what used to be a busy industry producing common sense, family values and moral standards, but they closed down years ago because nobody wanted their products anymore. But now part of the lead track to it serves as a pulpwood loading spur. Now in this last drawing, here is the upper deck finished. Note that I have filled in this area under the stairs. That is because a few weeks ago I was finally given the final dimensions. I also had the client go down in the basement and take accurate measurements throughout, just to make sure one last time. And it's a good job that we did, because the room is about 1.5 inches shorter than it was supposed to be. And this central wall is also not quite where it was. It's about 2 inches lower on this drawing than it used to be, which actually is very convenient because we now have more space for this industry, which was extremely cramped before. We did lose a little bit of real estate on this pier, and I made the decision to reduce it from 3 tracks to 2 so that it doesn't feel too cramped. And this ship is drawn the actual size of a couple of models that are available from a company called Dean's Marine. They produce a good variety of ships in 1/96th scale, which will look fine on an HO scale layout. Anyway, I guess that completes this layout design, but it's not the last you will see of this railroad, because I have the contract to build it for the client, and as of the time of recording this, I have already built the lower staging yard. Before signing off, I'm just going to bring up the original railroad design one more time. So if you're interested, you can compare the two designs, and feel free to leave a comment down below. Let me know which one you like best and why. And I will just sign off here until next week, and I hope to see you back then. So in the meantime, thanks for watching, and bye for now.